Well, hello again. I'm Lucas Martekian. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute at the New York Botanical Garden. Welcome to the third webinar in the 2025 Plant Humanities Conversation Series, co-organized by the New York Botanical Garden and Dumbarton Oaks. Plant Humanities is the emerging field that brings together scientists, humanists, and artists to explain the many and profound ways that plants have shaped human cultures. And as I said, I'm one of the co-organizers of this series, along with Dr. Yota Batsaki, Executive Director of Dumbarton Oaks and Principal Investigator of the Plant Humanities Initiative. The third session of this series is devoted to how the arts can engage with scientific research to explore a pressing issue in our biodiversity crisis, plant extinction, and its scientific and artistic counterpart, plant resurrection. As we often say when we introduce this series with Yota, plants are the primary ecosystem builders supporting all life on Earth, and yet 45% of all flowering plants are threatened with extinction. This is one of the reasons driving many contemporary artists to engage with the vegetal world, not only as a source of inspiration, but as a site of aesthetic and ethical questions. From a rebirth of botanical illustration and landscape photography to experimenting with living material in the museum and gallery space, and from research on botanical archives to public design interventions, artists are one of the leading agents in trying to make sense of the accelerated rate at which plant species are disappearing. Our speakers today engage with technological advances and scientific research that counter extinction, not to translate this into digestible artistic pieces, but rather to create artworks that reimagine the possibilities and the limits of science and technology. We'll hear today from Daisy Ginsberg, who will share her work as it explores the human impulse to better the world through technology, and from Debora Hirsch, who will show how her practice elaborates snapshots of an ongoing inquiry on plant life that blends AI and botanical research. The presentations will be followed by a conversation moderated by author and researcher Matthew Battles, whose writing also seeks to redefine what we understand by words such as natural, wild, and feral. And we invite all of you to pose your questions during the presentations in the Q&A box. Now I will turn it to Yota, who will formally introduce our speakers.
Thank you, and a warm welcome from me as well. And a thank you to Lucas for curating this conversation. It's a privilege to introduce our speakers today. I will speak about all three, and then we'll go directly into the presentations. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg is a multidisciplinary artist examining our fraught relationships with nature and technology. She experiments with simulation, representation, and the non-human perspective to question our ongoing societal fixation on innovation over preservation. In 2023, she won the STARTS Grand Prize Artistic Exploration for her experimental interspecies living artwork, Pollinator Pathmaker. She received her PhD from the Royal College of Art and is resident at Somerset House Studios, London. Debora Hirsch is a visual artist whose work focuses on biodiversity preservation and endangered species, contemporary anthropology, and the influence of media and technology on culture and society. Her research-based practice often explores the lingering impact of colonial histories and the evolving relationship between humans and the plant world. In seeking to restore the complexity of the real, her artworks draw on multiple references: botanical, ecological, historical, and cultural. Matthew Battles is the editor of Arnoldia, The Nature of Trees, the magazine of Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, and is a lecturer in comparative media studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His most recent book, Tree, was published by Bloomsbury in 2017, and Matthew has been a really valued and close collaborator in the Plant Humanities Initiative with Dumbarton Oaks and NYBG. So welcome to our speakers, and Daisy, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and delighted to hopefully have be challenged in the conversation afterwards with Matthew and Debora. I'd like to share with you 4 different artworks from the last 6 or 7 years that are all sort of dealing with the questions we're discussing in very different ways. I spent about 10 years hanging out with genetic engineers prior to doing my PhD. And these genetic engineers are a particular group called synthetic biologists. And I was so struck by how these scientists and engineers were coming into biology with the idea that they could make nature better. And that sort of opened up a whole world of thinking for me about how scientists and engineers and technologists and Western society in general looks at nature as this object to be exploited. And that really is sort of the framing device around when I build my work. So I'm going to start with this piece, Resurrecting the Sublime, which is a collaborative artwork between Ginkgo Bioworks, a synthetic biology company based in Boston, and the smell artist Sissel Tolaas and myself. And it began with Christina Agapakis, a scientist at Ginkgo Bioworks, going to the Harvard Herbarium and looking for extinct flowers from the IUCN Red List. She found about 10 different specimens in the stacks, and these are three of them. On the left, the Hibiscadelphus wilderianus, a plant from Hawaii that went extinct around 1912. It was last seen. In the center, the Orbexilum stipulatum, a scurf pea from Ohio, and on the right, a Leucodendron grandiflorum, which is a kind of protea from Cape Town that has a very contested history, but I will explain a little bit more. And the idea was to try to resurrect the smell of extinct flowers. And for Ginkgo, as a biotech company, it's interesting to find new molecules. But this was a very experimental process of taking DNA from the pressed specimens, some of which were 150 years old or 200 years old, and then trying to assemble the degraded DNA into readable sequences. And they worked with paleogeneticists at UCSD to rebuild these sequences and then insert what may be encoding for smell producing genes that will produce molecules that smell, putting those genes into yeast and then brewing the yeast essentially to produce these different molecules. What we got from this was a list of smell molecules that each plant produced. And from that, we worked with Sissel Tolaas, who is a smell artist based in Berlin, to reconstruct the smell of each of these flowers. So this is just a little excerpt from a film I made of one of these flowers. This is the Hibiscadelphus on Mount Haleakala in Hawaii. And this landscape was destroyed by cattle ranching in the 1910s when Americans came in with their cattle and destroyed the lava forest. This is the site of the Leucodendron in Cape Town, the back of Table Mountain, right by Kirstenbosch Gardens, which you may be familiar with. And this flower was last seen in 1805 in a collector's garden in London, not actually described in Cape Town where it was from. And it was thought that it just grew on this one particular section of Weinberg Hill. And the third, this scurf pea, grew on an island in the Ohio River by Louisville. And the island disappeared in the 1930s, I think, when the river basin was flooded with the dam. So the island went and the pea flower disappeared. So from those smell molecules, I created these installations where the smells are diffused within these sort of natural history style museum vitrines. Within each vitrine, we just have the landscape, the remnants of the geology of each of these places. So for Hawaii, we had lava, for Cape Town, granite, and for the Ohio River, a limestone. And the visitors enter into these empty vitrines and become essentially the animals on show. They are the subjects of the extinction story. And around you are the smells of each of the lost flowers. We did a few different iterations of this artwork, and for me, sort of playing with the language of the Natural History Museum and these sort of tropes of post-Enlightenment, sort of aesthetic experience is part of what interests me, the models that we create the world around and how we then understand the world through those models. So in this particular installation at the Natural History Museum in Bern, the exhibition called Apocalypse ended with this door. And visitors were invited to go through what looked like the back of house. And then they ended up inside the diorama themselves, again, with the dark room on the other side becoming the subject. of the extinction story. And inside this vitrine, a soundscape reconstructing the lost landscape, but the smell of this lost flower was being diffused around them. Of course, we can't know what these flowers smelled like. We don't know if those smelly molecules in particular were produced by the flowers, whether they were just happened to be in the plant, or whether the genes are even switched on. So it becomes an entirely speculative process. And again, this for me is where I described my relationship with science and technology and innovation. This work is really questioning the stories of de-extinction and the promises that we're being given that we can reconstruct an ecosystem or reconstruct nature. The reconstructed landscape here is a poor substitute for something that once existed, and that whole ecosystem has disappeared now. So that work for me in 2019 to have led on to a body of work dealing with extinction and biodiversity loss and the false archive in different species, from birds to rhinoceroses, but I won't share those because they're not relevant to plants today. Instead, I'm going to show you another extinction monument, which is a piece that I made last year for the Manifesta biennial that happened in Barcelona. And I was offered the chance to make an installation for this immense former power station that is just a monument to fossil fuel, which is in the eastern shore of Barcelona. And one of the nicknames of this power station is the Cathedral of the Workers. And of course, Barcelona has the famous Sagrada Familia, and it's in a way these are twin sites. And I wanted to make a monument to the invisible workers in this particular instance, which is, of course, fossil fuel and the organisms that allow us to live the lives that we lead. This is Proterocladus antiquus, which I think is still currently the oldest specimen of a chloroplast producing plant. So this is a seaweed that has been dated to about 1 billion years old, and the scientist who described it sort of calls it the evolutionary sister of the great-great-grandmother of all plants alive on Earth today. So this plant had chloroplasts, which contain chlorophyll and are able to capture the light from the sun and turn it into energy. And if we think about it, apart from some very particular examples of extremophiles, everything on Earth eats light. We rely on plants to convert energy from the sun for us, and then we either eat plants or we eat animals that eat plants. And this is the sort of monumental grain of rice size hero of the story. So this is the window that I made with the producers of the windows of the Sagrada Familia. So this was such fun to create a 3 meter by 6 meter window for this festival that was within the power station and really sort of blew up this little worker to a monumental scale. I'll show you something very different now, which is thinking about plant life in a completely different way. I was invited to make a piece of work for an exhibition at the Design Museum in London about colonizing Mars. And I am not very positively attuned to the idea of colonizing anything, and particularly Mars and its presentation as a planet B. I find very alarming and dangerous as an idea, the idea that we can terraform this other world. So I suggested I would do something quite different, which was to imagine a heterotopia, a different world that is not better or worse. It's not terraformed like Earth, but instead it's a repository for plant life from Earth. So it is a violent act of sending plant life from Earth, but instead the plant life is allowed to evolve in its own direction, and no human ever goes there. So the work itself was presented as two simultaneous simulations that run over 1 million years, and there's no description of who's sending these plants, but the thing just runs and you slowly see the landscapes being taken over. I worked with scientists from NASA and geoplanetary scientists from Brown, and this was so much fun because we hear a lot about plant life on Mars, and it's normally potatoes and tomatoes. And when it really came down to discussing, well, what organisms could survive in the Martian environment, which is the air is like dry cleaning fluid, really, I think we all got a bit stumped. And that reality of the situation, the idea that this could be a habitable place for anything beyond an extremophile, shows how crazy it is to rely on Mars as the salvation from Earth. So this was an extremely elaborate and complex thing to do, to build a multi-species ecological simulation. And it starts with some cyanobacteria and other extremophiles from Earth. And over the million years, we see just through this webcam view, plants from our first set of pioneers evolving and new species emerging. So we built this whole simulation system, trying to simplify the complexity of ecosystems and working out how we would start from terraforming the planet, only in that we would need to release water from the icy snow caps, and then thinking about, again, using references from art history, and here the paintings of the sublime landscape as a reference, but here the colonization is just through plant life. And I'll show you this. In this, you see two simulations running side by side, and it was important to me to show that there's no one way the world could go. That within this universe, this storytelling universe, there were at least two in this case, that on view different ways that the world could be, and other worlds are possible. So these are some of the species that emerged, again, not very lifelike, but the fun here was working out how the Linnaean system could extend to another planet. And I consulted various philosophers of biology. I decided on going for a trinomial system. And one of them, Maureen O'Malley from Exeter University, said, well, you can call them whatever you want because they don't exist, which I really enjoyed. So the trinomial system was the outcome. And these are some of the evolutionary generations from that system. And finally, I'll talk about a very different kind of artwork. This is a living artwork that I've been working on for the last 5 years. And it was originally commissioned by the Eden Project in Cornwall. And they asked me to make a sculpture to bring attention to the crisis facing pollinating insects. And I've done lots of these digital artworks or smell-based artworks, which are referencing and trying to give us an emotional response to the ecological crises we face. But I was struggling with this idea of agency and what can an audience do? What tools do we need? What, as an artist in an age of crisis, what is my role? And I decided it would be much more interesting to make an artwork for pollinators, since it was going to be outdoors, rather than to make another monument for humans to tell stories about. So I began with that premise and then had to really quickly figure out what an artwork for pollinators might be. And I started with the work of Dr. Jolyon Troscianko, who's an ethologist who studies insect vision. On the left is how we see a geranium, and on the right is how a simulation of how a bee might see it, because bees can't see the color red, but they can see ultraviolet. Now, butterflies can see red and ultraviolet, and there's even insects with 15-dimensional color perception. So for us to even imagine what the world looks like to another species is very, very difficult. And I was really struck by this image of a landscape here, the bluebell meadow on the right in the simulated pollinator vision. But of course, that's not the whole story, because depth is different, and the way that we map a landscape is different, and the way we fly past things or walk past things, our flicker thresholds are different. And so I decided to create a way that my visual preferences and my aesthetic preferences wouldn't get in the way. I decided I'd make an algorithm that could design the planting for these artworks, and that planting would be designed for insect taste and not for human taste. And this would be an experiment in making a technology that would serve other species before humans, and whether that's even possible. So the research question became this: if pollinators design gardens, what would humans see? And could I use this algorithm to turn myself away from seeing the garden as a thing that belongs to me, and instead seeing it belonging to the more than human? So there is a website which you can go to called pollinator.art. And at the moment it's European, but there will be some exciting updates later this year, which I can't really talk about, but more regions will be added. You go to pollinator.art and you can choose the size of your plot. and the soil conditions, and create the basis for your living artwork. Then you can play with the algorithm itself, which is this optimization algorithm. And whatever you do, it will maximize diversity of insect species served by the artwork. You can only play with how intricate the pattern and whether you have more paths for bees visible in the pattern or patches for beetles. Every time you run it, it creates a new artwork, and you can fly through this and explore it. You have no choice over where the plants go, but you can experience it like an insect zooming in to the living artwork. I'll jump along a bit here. So I also created this vision filter to simulate pollinator vision. So again, you can experience the garden through the seasons, to think of it as a place that exists in space, not just in time, not just in space. And then crucially, this is a real thing, is that you can download a PDF that gives you the edition number for your artwork and a plant list and a planting plan and instructions how to plant it. So this is the first one we planted at the Eden Project in Cornwall. It's a 52-meter long garden and 2 huge beds with about 7,000 plants. And this was it in its first summer. So this is all designed by the algorithm. Uncannily, it looks nice, which was unfortunate because I was trying to make very strange looking gardens, but it turns out humans like flowers and like looking at them. This is a visualization of the edition that we planted for the Serpentine in Hyde Park in London. And there's elements in here also of one that we've done in Berlin. So feeling when I'm creating these, all I can do is fly through them, and then there's no ability for me to move things around or reevaluate where plants should go, which is extremely frustrating and is the point, because I have to let go and I can't be in control of rebuilding the world around me. So this is the Serpentine edition in Hyde Park. And this is the beginnings of the edition at the Museum für Naturkunde Berlin, the Natural History Museum in Berlin. So this is the forecourt before, and this was a few months after planting, and this was it last summer. On the website, we have this DIY campaign where you can make your own planting plan, and this is a really key part of it, is to get people planting their own editions of the artwork. So using the language and value of the artwork, but twisting it around so the value is not in scarcity, it's in plentifulness. So your garden supports the neighbour's garden, more editions support each other. This is from my one at home. I was not a gardener before this. I planted one, I became a gardener. And I've started to explore different ways of sort of playing with this. What is this more than human experience? So this is a 14.5-meter tapestry. One side of it is pollinator vision, the other side is human vision. It's now installed in a staircase, and you can walk around it and feel like you're approaching the flowers themselves through the seasons over the year. So it starts in spring, works its way down through to autumn and back to spring again. And I'll just finish up with this, just opened last week. I had the opportunity to create a scheme for the British Library in London for the forecourt. So they're not going to dig up the forecourt and plant this, but this is a prospective garden that should be planted, covering the entire forecourt, leaving very little room for humans. And the video that is installed kind of takes you through that, through the seasons from the insect perspective over the year. And finally, we have just started with the University of Exeter and Edinburgh, a major research project in this village in Cornwall called Constantine, where we have recruited 17 residents to plant an edition of the artwork in their gardens. And we have 15 control gardens. And we're studying with network ecologists how the insects are flying through the village and between the artworks, working with social scientists to look at how the humans are interacting with the artworks and what it means to look after an artwork in this way. And we have a philosopher on board to help understand what is a garden and who is it for. So so showing this in contrast to the other more traditional museum works is really, for me, this sort of focus on how as an artist can we shift our perspectives, and how can I use an artwork to transform the way we see biodiversity and its value, not just tell stories of loss, but also to help so I think hope is a very strong word, because I feel very hopeless in the face of ecological collapse. But this attitude change is so important. How can we look at the value of nature in a different way and shift our state from consuming into caretaking? And Pollinator Pathmaker is an attempt to use art as a tool to spend time watering a garden and looking at a bumblebee's bottom sticking out of a foxglove and thinking that it's of great value. So I invite you to play with this website, and I look forward to talking about it. If there's any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy. It was absolutely terrific. Debora, over to you.
Thank you, Lucas Mertehikian, for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to participate in this conversation. In my artistic research, I focus on endangered plant species and biodiversity loss. While preparing for today, I reflect on what it means to resurrect a plant that has vanished, not just in form, but in meaning, to carry forward the knowledge and the cultural narratives that once surrounded it. The inspiration for my plant project that started at the end of year 2022 came from the Roman fresco of the Villa of Livia, wife of Emperor Augustus, and from a conversation with Professor Cornelia Lauf. What struck me was how much ancient cultures understood plants. They depended on them for food, medicine, rituals, textiles, housing, for every essential aspect of life. Writers like Virgil and Pliny showed a deep understanding of biodiversity, even though the term itself didn't exist. They wrote about soil and land and about the benefits of biodiversity for health and nutrition. Today, we've forgotten much of that. There are over 25,000 edible plant species, yet fewer than 20 now provide 90% of what we eat. This is not only a loss of biodiversity, it's a loss of cultural understanding, of imagination, and of possibility. When I look at the fresco with its 69 different birds and 150 plant species arranged outside any seasonal logic, I realize it wasn't meant to be a portrait of a real garden. It was something else. I would say an almost visionary botanical archive. That's what stayed with me. I began to wonder whether these species were still alive today, and if not, what traces of them remained. That question became the starting point of Plant. Like the fresco, my work brings together plants from different geographies. Plants don't recognize borders or frontiers. Ecosystems are in constant transformation and adaptation. Over time, some species will disappear, others will emerge, some will hybridize and evolve. But today, habitat loss is outpacing the ability plants have to adapt. Environmental destruction is so fast that many species can't keep up, and we are witnessing a significant loss of biodiversity. Libya's fresco has been remarkably well preserved for over 2,000 years, partly because the plaster was laid over tiles rather than directly on the wall, which helped protect it from humidity. The medium indeed played a key role in its preservation. In my work, I'm using the blockchain. I recreate plants using artificial intelligence, and I register them permanently on the blockchain. I'm building a symbolic, lasting, unchangeable virtual collection of plants we are excluding. The paintings you are seeing here are part of my firmamento research, which explores parallels between the digital colonialism we experience today and the historical colonialism of the Americas, including the environmental exploitation that began at that time. It reflects a commodified view of the plant world, seeing plants not as living beings with ecological and cultural value, but mainly as resources to be exploited, traded, or controlled for profit. Historical colonialism disregarded sustainable practices from many diverse indigenous populations, privileging monoculture. This exploitative logic was later intensified by industrial agriculture. More recently, indigenous practices have started to be reconsidered for agriculture. If artificial intelligence and other technologies align with ecological intelligence, they could support both large-scale sustainable agriculture and smaller, locally managed farming systems rooted in specific communities. The environments in my plant compositions do not refer to real ecosystems. They exist in imaginary environments generated by machine learning model that is based on statistical inference. I use an AI model fine-tuned on my dataset, which involves a segment of my own artworks, such as paintings, drawings, video frames, and images I've collected over time from the colonial period in the Americas, including architectural details, objects, artifacts, as well as tapestries, engravings, maps, each carrying its own history and visual language. These constructed environments are shaped by real stories, by images that carry traces of both violence and beauty, preservation and erasure. I'm not trying to reproduce nature as it is, but to speculate on what it remembers and on what it might still become. In this speculative space, I plan to contemplate species that are disappearing before they are even described to science. Biodiversity exists beyond what science has found so far. I also want to incorporate species that are not endangered. They are doing well, but are undergoing a reduction in abundance and biomass. I want to address the diminishing presence of vital species that sustain our environment. In my plant project, I select outcomes from numerous artificial intelligence-generated configurations. I then do significant post-production to create my compositions. Many of the plants I work with were completely unknown to me at first. I often collaborate with botanists and scientists to select and better understand the species I include in my work. What I find both fascinating and unsettling is that many of these species, which sometimes seem totally unimportant, usually play a fundamental role in the ecosystems. Sometimes the extinction of a single, apparently minor species can provoke a partial or even wider habitat collapse. I think that drawing attention to individual plants, challenges, and narratives in my work really matters. It creates a sense of reality, of closeness and connection, and a sense of agency at a time when so much is vanishing. The plant you see here in this artwork is Dianthus guliae. It is in the collection of Santa Maria della Scala Museum. I selected it together with the director of Siena Botanical Garden. It was listed as critically endangered in Tuscany at that time. Sadly, it is now likely extinct in Tuscany. What struck me is how quietly this species disappeared. It wasn't famous or spectacular, just a small, delicate flower, but it carried a history of loss, fragility, and inbred depression. I already spoke about my data sets, but I want to emphasize just how essential they are to my work. When what I fed into the artificial intelligence, the images, the references, come from years of practice, memory, and personal experience. That's what allows the outcomes to resonate with my work. We often rely on data to preserve facts, to build a sense of certainty. But when art engages with machine learning, it can do something different as well. It can preserve, indeed, uncertainty, memory, and even contradiction, allowing space for what is complex, unresolved, or uncomfortable. And in the face of ecological loss, that space for reflection and emotional connection may be as necessary as facts. This is a video still from the Plantalia animation. Plantalia is always evolving. I update it every time a new plant species is added to the archive. It's a permanent work in progress in a way. The plants in Plantalia exist in a state of suspended perpetual transformation. The configuration is delicate. The aesthetic balance depends on every single element. If one part shifts too much, the whole structure risks falling apart. But this isn't just an artistic gesture. It's a logic I've inherited from ecosystems themselves. In nature, everything is connected. As I was mentioning before, if even the disappearance of a single species can trigger a cascade, the disruption caused by man can disentangle an entire web. So what you see here isn't just a visual experiment. It's a reflection of how ecosystems behave and how precarious our relationship with them have become. Most of my works grow out of conversations I've had with scientists, humanists, and botanists, like in the case of a herbaria. I remember one botanist telling me about a restoration project he was involved in, and the difficulty to bring a species back to life once it's gone extinct in the wild. Restoration is incredibly complex, challenging, unstable, and rare. Here you can see the Castanea dentata, the iconic American chestnut, which is a critically endangered species in the International Union for Conservation of Nature database. This species is under a restoration project to prevent it from going extinct in the wild, and it is part of my video animation herbaria. Herbaria is a video animation and also installation. Just the act of animating these herbarium specimens is a way of recognize their absence. On the right, you see, I just wanted to show this page from the herbario from the New York Botanical Garden. It is a species that went extinct from Hawaii. In the animation, the plants I bring to life appear as solitary entities, disconnected from the environment they once belonged to. They flicker into motion for a moment, then fade back into the cabinets they came from. But even if these resurrections only last a few seconds, in that brief time, they asserted their presence. I supplement the missing parts of the dried plants from the herbarium by assembling and painting them digitally, following the practice of the herbarium vivum. The outcome suggests that beauty is not ornamental, it is structural, and that fragility too can be a form of knowledge. This work holds on reanimation not as nostalgia, but as forward-moving act. To remember is to rejoin what was separated, to give coherence back to a broken continuity. We often assume we can classify, organize, and manage everything, but that mindset doesn't always apply to nature. In his book, 3, Matthew Battles writes about how unsettled we may become when we are confronted with forms of life that refuse conformity and containment. He explores the idea of virality through plants that grow outside human intention. One example is the tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, a species that flourishes in abundant spaces, parking lots, urban environments. He invites us to see these organisms not just as wild or domesticated, but as something else. Life that operates beyond our design. An adaptation without permission. A reminder that not everything belongs to our systems of order and aesthetics. This idea helped me make sense of the birds that appear in my work. They emerge in my compositions alongside the plants, but unlike the plants, they didn't correspond to a specific species I was searching for. They weren't classified or intentional. They appeared algorithmically, unexpectedly, and unsolicited. and I chose to embrace them. I not only accepted their presence, I began encouraging it by almost never building a composition without them. That's how silverbirds began. They represent a kind of unpredictability, a creative, living agency within the artistic process itself. In my installations, these birds are shown at human scale. They are no longer tiny figures up in a distant sky. They are right there, face to face with the viewer. They are not static. They are animated. They are a presence. And by enlarging them, I'm collapsing the distance between species. The encounter becomes something more active, a shared space of perception and connection, with messages to be deciphered, like in Roman divination or auspicia. Silverbird embraces a different way of being that welcomes complexity, acknowledges dissonance, and moves beyond the fantasy of purity. Resurrection is not a miracle, it's a method, a politics, a commitment, and perhaps in the end is our only way forward. My current work is moving further into the field of humanities. It's a privilege to take part in this conversation today, especially alongside such prominent professionals engaged in the field. I believe that dismantling the instrumental paradigm that has long shaped our relationship with the plant world will not come only through data, but through situated, specific, and sometimes uncomfortable storytelling. My first aim is always artistic, but this work has a commitment, let's say, a commitment to nature. I try to foreground plants not as objects, but as presences, so that people might connect with the natural world in a much more reverent way. If you are to envision forms of coexistence that are not built on domination, we will need approaches capable of holding complexities and commitment to the plant world. Thank you.
Thank you, Debora, for this very thought-provoking presentation, nudging us out of our comfort zone. And now to our respondent, Matthew, please.
Oh my goodness! What a thrill and a joy it is to hear Daisy and Deborah talk about their work and take us on a tour through all of these rich projects. I'm really honored to be a part of this. Thank you, Lucas and Yoda, for bringing us all together. What I'm going to do is, I mean, I have too many things to say, but I'll try to limit my own sort of response to about 5 minutes. I'll try to end with a question for both Deborah and Daisy to take up, and then we'll move into sharing the questions that the audience might have as well, and getting into dialogue with those questions. So, as I stand here, I'm in the Arnold Arboretum. I'm in a building in the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, where my office looks out on the landscape. It looks out on a meadow that's full of plants that represent plants that are thought of as native to this place, and plants that are introduced here, plants that were curated, and plants that showed up on their own, that curated themselves. In the last few weeks, a lot of these plants have been beginning to bloom in the spring. Among them, the magnolias, which are some of the oldest flowering plants that are still with us. And those fragrances have flooded through my window whenever I can keep it open. My window's open right now, and I'm not detecting the fragrance of magnolia. A shift has taken place. There's an absence there. Um, I remember learning a few years ago um, how olfaction works in sort of our human sensorium, that we're often what we're often smelling or often detecting is a difference, something new, something that's emerged, a new olfactory signal. And often when we are experiencing the absence of fragrance, what we're doing is remembering that all the things where our nose is actually encountering are familiar, and nothing's changed there. So there's this strange and uncanny way, as I understand it, that our olfaction works. It makes it hard for us to encounter absence, and so many of our senses um, seem to foil attempts to come into relationship with absence. And so, I mean, I think both Daisy and Deborah's work really orients us toward absence in vivid ways, in living ways, in dialogic ways, and asks us to come into relationship with that absence. And I think that's really important for us to attend to in this time. These projects also made me think about scale. I mean, I really am wowed, Daisy, by the Four Epochs project. I'd love to climb that staircase sometime. And the prospect of coming into a relationship with plants at the scale of a pollinator feels to me like a really vital thing to do. And then by the same token, Deborah's birds at human scale, which then, of course, conversely makes us into bird-like scalar creatures as well, um, seems like an important move to make, an important kind of um, uh, intellectual and cognitive habit to cultivate, is a kind of scalar awareness that isn't simply a kind of powers of 10 slide from one scale to another, where we think very simply that we can come into a relationship with molecules and galaxies, that they're all at the human scale at some level. I say powers of 10 referencing a famous film which many of you have probably seen, by Charles and Ray Eames, which depicts a kind of movement of scale from the meter scale, looking down on a couple having a picnic in a park in Chicago, out to the scale of the interstellar, the intergalactic, and then into the scale of the subatomic particle. And that kind of scalar smooth movement, which isn't movement at all, of course, um, can fool us into thinking that we can measure and comprehend these scales. And I think um, that art like Deborah's and Daisy's, that's in dialogue with scales, is also in dialogue with the disjuncture and the need to honor and come into relationship with those scalar differences. That it's very different to think alongside a plant that has an evolutionary lifespan that's measured in millions of years, or the extinction or increasing rarity of a plant due to forces of capitalism, exploitation, colonialism, that may be measured on intergenerational scales. What is our role in that? How do we participate in that? How do we dialogue with that? I think this is work that invites us to ask these questions, and to refuse simple answers to those questions. Um, that makes me think about the anthropologist Eduardo Kohn, uh, who wrote a very provocative book more than a decade ago now, How Forests Think, decentering the anthropos in anthropology. As an anthropologist, asking how to write ethnographically, how to write an account of meanings that are interspecies, vastly interspecies, on the level of a forest. And one thing that Cohn asks us to do is to provincialize language, to acknowledge language not as a kind of transparent medium of the traffic of meaning, but as a peculiarly human way of making meaning, amidst an ecology of other ways of making meaning. In the same way, I think, art like Debora's and Daisy's is inviting us to provincialize science in a way. Um, a kind of typical or normative definition of science historically has been giving voice to nature, making nature speak, right? And being a kind of offering itself as a kind of transparent medium for nature to speak. When in fact we know that science has dialects, that science has ways of looking at the world, ways of looking at the world that are peculiar and provincial, that are also very powerful. And so rather than simply presenting a platform um, for science to speak nature to us, work like Deborah's and Daisy's invites us into dialogue with science. I mean, it makes me wonder what kind of dialogue we have now, we need to have now with science and technology, the technologies that Daisy and Deborah are using so fluently and at the same time consciously, whether that's blockchain or artificial intelligence, or genomics. I mean, many of these are bound up in really strange, let's face it, Frankensteinian ways right now, and they're being promoted to us. They're being commoditized, productized to us. I can't help but think about the recent news about Colossal and the dire wolf, the sort of creation of a creature that looks like a charismatic extinct species, and reading some of the reporting of that. One of the scientists involved, Beth Shapiro, who's been involved in some of your work, Daisy, I realize, and now is working with Colossal. She's a paleogenomics researcher, formerly at University of California, Santa Cruz. And she talked about how with the direwolf, they were trying to create the phenotypic version of a direwolf. In other words, they're trying to create something that looks and acts that feels like this lost species. There is a creative and artistic, I hesitate to say artistic, but certainly a designerly, certainly a performative dimension to that project. And I think that what we've been talking about, what we've been learning about with Deborah and Daisy today, presents us with ways to think into and feel into these projects, these technologies, to take a critical standpoint, to measure our relationship with them, and ask questions about their impact and their worth. And these relational dimensions of work like this do ultimately lead us to care, to responsibility, to being in relation. And one of the things that I think is so beautiful about the birds that arise, Deborah, in your plant work, is that they are arising spontaneously because there's a relationship there. They're arising in and as relation, and the ways in which we come to relation rather than the essentialized, the species as something to pin to a board or put into an herbarium sheet and file away. I think is a moving turn that art can help us to make. So I guess one question that I kind of want to close with, and see what both of you might think of, how it might prompt thoughts in you, is like thinking about some of the more industrialized, commercialized, productized elaborations that I've talked about, particularly like the de-extinction of species like the direwolf or the mastodon, which Daisy in particular, you've taken pains to distinguish your work from that line. But how do we understand de-extinction? How might we understand artificial intelligence and large language models? How might we understand the blockchain from the perspective of plants? If we take the plants role do the plants have a relationship with these technologies? Do they have a viewpoint? Do they have standing in this conversation? And what might that look like or feel like or smell like? And invite either of you to respond to that.
That is an excellent question. I'll go very quickly, and then Deborah, you can say something far more uh, profound, I think. Do plants care? I mean, I don't know. I think that for me, that's the interesting part is about value. So as a scribe, a lot of what I'm doing is anthropomorphizing nature. So in pollinator pathmaker, you're making the insects the consumers of the artwork and the visitors, and trying to imagine how the pollinators would design. And the point of that is to try and get us into their world, because it's impossible for us even to imagine what it is because we're not in that world. So do plants care about technology? I imagine not at all. Their value systems are not that way inclined because they don't have value systems. They're just surviving. And that's what we're also doing, but we've made more elaborate ways to do that. I think that what's interesting is the relationship between plants and these technologies. So how these technologies impact plants and how they exploit the more than human, and how they, in a way, misunderstand what it is to be a plant. So if you are the de-extinction element, I feel very strange about, and so everything Deborah was saying and sort of looking at in Resurrecting the Sublime is you can't just recreate one organism. It's a complex ecosystem. So to imagine that the solution to climate change is bringing back mammoths on the Siberian steppe is going to solve a whole load of different ecosystem things is just to miss out the whole political, social, and economic factors that have caused us to want to bring mammoths back to eat grass there. And with the other technologies, I mean, there's all these environmental aspects to these technologies as well. So the use of water. If I am a plant, I probably do care if I can't get water because it's all being sucked in by another living organism, which is an AI data center. So I think plants don't care about technology. They don't care. They're existing. But technologies care about plants and they don't take care of plants, I would say. That would be my provocation back to give to Deborah to deal with.
Nice.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because we know that plants, they have their intelligence and they try to influence other players in the environment to act in a certain way, to give them protection, survival, possibilities, and so on. So it would be interesting if plants could play in the same way that they do in the ecosystem, how they manage to obtain things from the other players. It would be so interesting to see if plants could play with technology some way. It's a very interesting question, I think. And maybe the future can reserve some surprises regarding this question. I took some notes on what you're saying before. I want to make some comments about the magnolias. The magnolias would be an excellent plant for us in Milan. Milan, it's a very polluted city, and I went to a seminar where the researchers talk about magnolias. And magnolias could have this potential of absorbing pollutants from the city. So it's very, very interesting plant. It's not incentivized, it's not promoted at all. The selection of plant species in an urban environment is not always done in a wise way. So, but magnolias is so interesting, and many of them are going under extinction right now. And what you said also about fragrance is so fascinating. There's the scientists that work with molecules, fragrance, and I was doing an exhibition, and he was creating fragrances for 5 species that are critically endangered. He has his own garden because he likes to experiment. He has a huge garden with many species and so on. But he decided not to use any natural fragrance, just to use synthetic molecules to reproduce that. And I thought it was something that makes you think about also that issue. And regarding the scales, it was so interesting during the exhibition, the relationship that people had with the bird animation on a large scale. It certainly provoked some cognitive process. Something happened because people were spending time in a kind of relationship with those birds. Some people thought they were scary. Others said interesting, like he wants to say something. So it was very interesting to play with scale in that specific exhibition. And last thing, when we talk about language as a way of making meaning, it came to my mind. Lawrence Weiner is is a conceptual German artist. German, I think, I'm not sure. But he used to use language in his installations, and his sentence was, "Language is matter." No, and I think language is so important right now in this moment of ecological crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Debora. Thank you both. I have a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll turn to the questions because there are a couple of questions that really tangle with what we've just talked about. I mean, I do love that attention to language. Language as a medium and as matter, something that takes up space. It takes up space and it demands space as well. I also just want to say thank you, Debora, for for sharing work that's grown from an encounter with my work. I was really thrilled to see that the feral was alive in your work, and that you had riffed so wonderfully off of what I put forward in my book. So that was really thrilling. And speaking of feral, Daisy, I'm curious. I mean, so many of the projects have been about isolating and then coming into very specific relation with perhaps a molecule or a set of molecules, or a signal or an organism. And then with the pollinator work, you're also planting these gardens, and knowing what gardens do, they invite, the feral, they invite intrusion, and they invite relation and collision. And so what's that dimension of the planting now, for you? Is that changing your practice and your approach at all to have a garden, but then all this other stuff like the birds, in Debora's output, stuff that shows up and gets tangled up?
I think you haven't lived until squirrels have eaten your work. So we planted in Hyde Park, beautifully planned with the serpentine, 250 meters of flower beds, and squirrels ate all the alliums the day after we planted them. And squirrels aren't even meant to like alliums. In fact, it's what you meant to plant to keep them away. And at the Eden Project, the deer dug up the euphorbia. I spent a lot of time complaining about nature, because when I thought, it'd be so easy to do gardens rather than video installations because we'd have to plug them in. So that's even worse. What was the worst idea of all is the idea that you could rationalize nature through a piece of software. Very naive and exciting challenge. So working with a fantastic team of horticulturists and experts to build these plant lists, to research everything. Perhaps one thing that maybe is interesting to people watching now is, what is the artwork? So we have this funny thing where we have to weed the artworks, and at what point, if you don't look after it enough, does it stop being the artwork? But also
Mm,
because it's about pollination, insects are coming and stealing bits of the artwork and taking it away and bringing other bits in. And if it's
mhm,
successful, it should all be pollinated. So then things throw out seeds, and different plants do that to different varying levels of success in different locations. So suddenly you've got something rampant moving across. And the style of planting is tightly packed perennial planting as a sustainable way of making these gardens. So we have a lot of grassy matrices that we recommend, like to put grass layer underneath as well for certain plants. But if you get over 20% weeds, is it the artwork anymore? Like this is
mm,
a really
mhm.
interesting question when you're working with museums is it still the
Yeah,
artwork? Can we,
mm, that's
have we lost
great.
control of it?
Yeah.
I think it's in front, is it in front of the Hamburger Bahnhof? I can't remember the name of the artist. He has a roundabout that he left just to grow weeds, and it's in front of the museum as a permanent installation. And apparently people complain about, oh, it looks so messy, but the
Hmm.
artwork is the anarchy. So
Hmm.
here
Hmm.
you are fighting a battle of working with an unnatural garden that's
Mm.
been designed for nature, so with the superabundance of flowers. And that's what the scientific research is showing us, is that actually this way of planting might accidentally be really good, because you've got drifts of large areas and then smaller, very sort of pixelated, intricate areas of different species mixed together. But it brings a new dimension to installing artwork and then looking after it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
the squirrels, psychopathic squirrels in Hyde Park will eat anything.
That's great. That's great. Well, I really love that attention to the question of, when does it cease being the artwork, or how is change
Yeah,
incorporated in the work, and the amplitude
yeah.
and the plenitude of relationality that
So
is
that's we're
invited
so
into.
this idea of the network is what we're studying down in Exeter with this study. Is really a garden is not an isolated thing to anyone except for to humans. Because
Hmm.
we build a wall
Hmm.
around it doesn't mean that
Right.
organisms using it are not walking around, flying around, or eating
Yeah.
bits of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So pollinator pathmaking, even the sort of tapestry sample behind me, so there's a small section of something new. It's boundaryless. So
Hmm. Hmm.
there's no enclosure, and I'm trying to like bring that messiness out, even though things do have to have boundaries in the physical
Yeah.
world of stuff that
Yeah.
humans make.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. I mean, often when I talk to colleagues about our landscape, 285 acres, maybe 100 hectares of garden, colleagues of mine like to say this isn't nature. This is designed, and of course, it is designed, and it's cared for in a kind of incredible intimacy. And it's not, the great horned owls are not designed. All of the flies and the midges, they're not designed. There's so much that shows up, and so it is edgeless. The edges are not even transgressed. They're not real. And I love work that brings us into relation with that. So I want to turn to, and I hope also, I do want to invite Lucas and Yota to interrogate our dialogue as well and to contribute. I do want to check in about a couple of the questions that have shown up in the Q&A because I think they're really pertinent and interesting. The first one, the one I'll start with, is from an anonymous attendee. And I'll read a little bit of it. I won't read the whole thing, but the questioner expresses concerns with how large language models and generative algorithms have become a technology primarily used for predatory means in the larger scope of society, right? Especially in the commercial sense, and expressing concern about the artworks and the literary works and the scholarship and the journalism, the social media profiles, the communication of working artists and thinkers that goes into those commercialized data sets, and wondering what methods of care should be used to ensure the safety of artists within the experimentation across art, science, and technology. Um, Whether it's using a local system, creating systems of reference and documentation. I think, Deborah, you alluded to contending with this question in a rich way when you talked about how your data set is a curated data set that's also an expression of you as an artist and as a human being. So I wonder, what you and what you as Daisy Daisy as well think how we should approach this question.
I think I learn a lot from other people in this field of artificial intelligence and generative art. So I am very grateful to people who helped me grow. I mean, there are some instruments, and the community likes to share a lot. And I would be happy if I could share my knowledge as well, because I've received so much, and I'm ready to share. If my, on one hand, in terms of process, coding, and so on the other hand, when I think about my imaginary, and if it may be used by others, I must say that it never bothers me. I'm not worried about that. I'm always happy to share what I have in terms of creativity. And it may happen, it happened in the past, many years ago, that people were using my visuals, and people say, but don't you complain? Aren't you worried about that? I said, no, I'm not. I keep going. I always look forward, and I have so many things to do, so much work. And if people are enjoying my works so much that they incorporate it in their development, in their research, I'm happy for that. I'm fine. I'm happy for that.
Any
Oh, I'm
thoughts,
going to
Daisy?
sound much less generous now. I mean, this is part of my fascination with working with AI, is to understand how it works, to understand the issues, and to understand the limits of it. So I've currently been making, I've made a few different models to do different things. One was to recreate birdsong, and we worked with the Macaulay Library at Cornell. It's on a piece
Mm-hmm.
called Machine Auguries to
Mm-hmm.
reconstruct the dawn chorus. And there's really, the difficulty of finding open source data sets is huge, of licensing and working ethically with AI. And it's very challenging as an artist when you realize everyone else is exploiting the artist. In the UK, there's just been a big consultation, and the government basically is like, well, these companies can just scrape artists' work and don't have to pay anything, because we need to support the AI industry as well as the artists. And I think for me, I think it's wrong. I think that we should be working to license things and pay the people who made the things the fee so they can make more of the things. I think Holly Herndon, for that particular question, might be interested. They don't know the work of Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who have been creating their own data sets for artists to work with. That's really interesting. But really important question, and thank you for flagging it, because for me, it's definitely part of the reason I work with these technologies, to understand why I feel protective by stuff.
Yeah. Thank you both. There's another question about pollinator pathways and the sort of practical considerations of a project like this. Jean asks if there are minimum size parameters for pollinator art, and mentions being part of a seed collective here in the northeastern United States, in Connecticut, and looking at pollinator pathmaker as a kind of addition to the practice of a group like that, interested in the data set to compare populations of pollinators using the art and seed production. So, I think that the question to me points to the question of how does a project like Pollinator Pathways, or any of your projects, relate to community practice, or to the practical?
So someone can, this was originally meant to be a sculpture. The ambition to make the world's largest climate positive artwork sort of emerged as other things emerged in the pandemic, accidentally. So we're just going region by region. So we've got support in the US just to make the plant list, but we don't have anything more than that. So for a few regions, which I can't specify what they are now, but Jean, please get in touch via pollinator.art website. What we're doing in Cornwall with this research project is the first experiment to see like making a larger landscape scale with smaller installations. On the website, we go up to 15 meters by 15 meters, and then anything over that becomes a commission. And the website is to plant in private spaces or in community spaces with permission. And then when we work with institutions and these big public gardens, they're like an art commission. So trying to find ways to keep this thing as open as possible for people to play with. We're planting one off Kensington High Street in London later this year with the Design Museum at a school. And that's really my goal, is to get people planting. But it's incredibly complicated to make it happen. So if you've got ideas, please get in touch. We need to bring one to the botanical gardens.
Here, here. Well, I do want to, Lucas, Yota, I want to invite you in if you've got questions or ideas that have emerged in the course of this session.
Lucas, do you want to intervene?
Yes, and there are other questions in the chat that we might be able to point. One that I wanted to ask, and I know I asked a similar question in our previous session, but I think one of the reasons why Yota and I started this series is because we're very interested in talking to people like you, Daisy and Debora, who bridge the gap and really seek out the opinions and consult with people in other fields to create your own work. So because I know a lot of people in our audience are trying to do similar work in their own fields, I wanted to ask you, how do you approach these collaborations? How do you seek out collaborators in particularly in science or in AI, and what would you recommend other people do in similar situation?
I always joke that it's the ones who reply to the email that I end up working with. So I work a lot with experts from across many different fields, and generally I found, if there's like a specific question, it's much easier to get someone's attention if you're like, I have this particular question, rather than like, I'm interested in. But when I teach, and the students are always asking, like, how do you build these relationships, and sort of going to conferences and just sort of building a network has been so important for me over the years. But absolutely, it's the person who replies to the email is most likely to end up as part of a conversation that continues, because otherwise it's just empty. Debora, do you have the same experience?
I have about the same experience. Going to conferences, seminars is really interesting, because besides being a learning opportunity, it's an opportunity to get to know people who you can collaborate with afterwards. And I must say, when I started working, I always introduced nature in my works, but I started working in this field intensively in 2022. And I must say that everything happened in a very organic way when we started, and then things developed or everything I needed. I have the feeling that everything I need I could get organically. And when it happened that I really need something very specific, as Daisy was saying, when you have a specific question in mind and you are in the middle of your research, I think that's a good way also to approach someone.
Thank you.
So do we have a minute for one question from the chat that I think connects with this? I think Felix Driver's question about sort of lineage comes to mind here, and not only, relationships with, how do you come into relation with other artists or scientists or other workers in the fields that you're adjacent to, but also the sort of lineage of work. Felix mentions Alan Sondrust's time landscape in Greenwich Village. Think of Agnes Dennis, the wheat field in New York, or Spiral Jetty, or the whole, world of land art and bio art. So my twist on this is, do you see yourselves as part of a lineage? Are there artists that have spurred you and inspired you? And what is the future of your own work? I mean, Deborah, you encounter this with the blockchain. You answer with the blockchain. What's your past, and what do you see as the future of your work?
I see my research going towards the field of humanities a lot, because I'm so interested in storytelling, and I would like to do that in an artistic way. And I want also to include not only individual endangered plant species, but also populations that are diminishing. The storytelling, I was thinking about starting working with the big, magnificent trees, because they are so important for ecosystems, and they normally carry strong, important stories, especially in my country of origin. I'm Brazilian, and there are certain big trees that are so important, culturally speaking, and they are in a state of they are critically endangered right now, and it would be interesting to talk about that, because any single Brazilian had a relationship with that tree or with the outcomes of the tree. So it's very, very fascinating for me. I think that one thing that gives me a lot of inspiration, it comes also from not only from the artwork. It comes from outside the artwork, the scientists, humanists, writers, and so on. The inspiration can come from any field. Whenever I find something that I consider precious to me, and it may ignite some ideas.
Wonderful.
How do I follow that up? Thank you, Felix, for this question, because I'm so happy to have discovered that artwork, because I didn't know it. So thank you. I've learnt something very important to me. But Agnes Dean and especially the feminist land artists are very important to me. I would like to see Pollinator Pathmaker as a provocation within the space of land art. That is, but sort of doing something a bit of a twist, which is actually using the language, like the playing with the value of art as it's not about the unique experience. Instead, it's about this multiplicity of identically unique experiences happening simultaneously. And moving forward, I mean, the challenge of being an artist is just trying to make work, and having, especially when doing these big, complicated, complex projects that involve so many moving parts, and working with technologies can get very expensive, and working with gardens it's very complicated. So it's just a perpetual sort of like need space to be creative. But I hope I carry on doing this. I find it really fascinating to pitch technology against my desire to be sitting under a tree. And that's, makes me, when I started out working with synthetic biologists, it was, why do I have a gut reaction about this? I need to understand that reaction. Why are humans exploiting living things? And the more involved I got, the more I understood, this was a political venture and an economic venture and a social venture, and these poor bacteria don't know what's going on. And the zooming out to work more urgently with our relationships with the natural world. I also, as Deborah's saying, I see it as a storytelling endeavor. I want people to find ways to engage with nature, and the museum is a really special place to capture people's imaginations, but outdoors is also a good place. So I also see myself as a storyteller. So thank you, Deborah, for putting that beautifully. But yeah, the battle is it takes a lot to make it happen. So
Here.
thank you, everyone, for giving us a platform to share the adventures we have.
I think I'm going to head outside. presently.
Sit under a tree for me, please.
Yes,
I'm
I
in the middle
shall.
of London
I
right
shall.
now.
Trees enough here to share. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Yoda and Lucas,
Thank you.
again. This has been really nourishing.
Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Deborah. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Daisy. Thank you, Matthew, for your wonderful presentations. Thank you, Yota, as always, for convening. Thank you all for attending and for your wonderful questions. We will have our next session on June 11th. So look out for emails from Dumbarton Oaks and NYBG about our next panel. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you
Thank
soon.
you.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Our panelists.